Well, as we continue through the chapter, I want to look at verse 29 today. A very fascinating passage to me, really, and maybe more than it would readily appear as I read it. But the text reads this way. It says, "Whoever brings ruin on their family will inherit only the wind, and the fool will be servant to the wise." So what he's telling us right now is that I have an obligation not to do things that are harmful to my family. And secondly, if I do, I'm proving that I'm a fool, and instead of being somebody who leads and rules, I'm going to be somebody who is really a servant, or more literally, the slave of those who have wisdom. So in a way, he's saying that bringing harm and hurt to your family is one of the most unwise things you can do. And it's all predicated really on the fifth commandment. Unless you're a Roman Catholic, does that make it a sixth commandment? I don't know. But anyway, the first commandment with a promise, Paul said. Remember what he said in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. He says, "Children, obey your parents because you belong to the Lord, for this is the right thing to do." And then he says, "Honor your mother and father." And then he adds, "This is the first commandment with a promise. If you honor your father and mother, things will go well for you and you will have a long life on earth." So it's interesting because what Paul says is God makes a promise to us if we honor our mother and father. And of course, honoring them is the complete opposite of bringing ruin to them. If we honor to them, he says that obedience to God's commandment will bring blessing on your life. In other words, you'll have God's divine favor, and you'll also live longer. And in other words, that there's many people whose lives are shortened because they disregarded the guidance and the counsel and the wisdom of their parents. Now, many of us who are parents, who are grandparents, and certainly all of us had parents. I was watching this video where this African-American pastor is saying, "How do you answer the question, who's your mother? What's a woman?" He said, "She's your mother." It's a very kind of obvious answer, but I digress. But what's really interesting to me is he's saying that if we do treat them in a way in which we respect them, not necessarily for who they have been or how they behaved or lived their life, but we respect them simply because we came from them. They're our parents. Our existence is a consequence of what they did on our behalf. And so he says, if you do that, God will show you favor in your life. You'll find yourself being successful and being effective, and you'll live a longer time than if you disregard what they say. In fact, I know that if I had continued to disregard my parents, as I did to some degree as a young man, I probably certainly wouldn't be here today, not only just doing this, but the trajectory my life was on was pretty destructive and would have probably ended much more sooner than God had really intended for it to end. And I think that's one of those things where people wonder what's the will for God's will for their life, is that oftentimes God's will for your life is that reach a certain chronological endpoint and then you go home to be with him. And there are many people, I think, who don't reach that because, as Solomon says later on in Proverbs, don't be overly wicked or overmuch wicked because you'll die before your time. And so we find that God can terminate a life earlier than what he had planned because he sees that it's never going to correct its course. So I think it even begins with those of us whose parents are long gone, that in my memory of my parents, I need to honor them. And I know all the weaknesses and faults and sins and a lot of stuff that my parents didn't do right. And yet they were my parents. And I stepped back and realized, despite the fact that they weren't perfect or even Christian most of my life, they were people who loved me and took care of me and tried to do the best for me. Now, I know some of you that's harder to say, but it's really important to say, I forgive them for where they fell short. And I need to learn from their mistakes and so that I don't repeat them. But also I want to honor them just for the fact that they gave me life. And that life gave me this opportunity to know God and to walk with him. And maybe their bad behavior is the thing that drove me to Christ in the first place. Regardless, it says, I need to honor them for the fact that I'm here, I have this opportunity, and I know that I'm going to heaven. Now, my parents came to the Lord at the end of their lives, which is, my dad lived to be 81, almost 82, and my mom lived to be 93. So It's pretty. In fact, she even died on her birthday, which was really crazy. But it's just amazing when you see that, because I know that one day I'm going to be with them in eternity, and all those things that were negatives in this world will not be factors anymore. And we'll live and reign with Christ together, celebrating and joyfully worshiping Him before the throne forever and ever and ever. I just look forward to that perfect reunion that many times we wanted to have on earth, but we can now have in heaven when we get there. But I think it's really important that we really not only seek to do that in our own hearts, because that will be translated to our own children. They'll see how we have treated or honored our parents, and they will then see that as the model that they should imitate. Because if you're always negative and blaming and angry and resentful towards your parents, they're going to look at you and say, well, I have permission to treat you the same way. And the scary thing is, they may very well do it, because you know what? They're going to see things in you that aren't exactly perfect either. And so I really encourage you to take this seriously, because if you want to live long and you want to have a blessed life, in many ways it begins not only by giving your life to Christ, obviously it's the first step, but as you give your life to Christ, Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And one of his commandments is that we should honor our mother and father and not live with bitter, resentful hearts towards them. A lot to think about. I pray that God will guide you in your thoughts. Blessings.